My name is Amanda Knowles, and I'm the director of the North Seattle College Art Gallery. And I am here with Markel Uriu, who is going to talk with us about her art. Where do you live? Where do you work? What do you do? What kind of work do you do?
So I'm an interdisciplinary artist, and I make a lot of installations, but have a background in drawing and painting. And then I live in Seattle, Washington. I have for the past 6 years now. So yeah.
How are you holding up with the coronavirus?
Uh,
And how is it impacting you, sort of in general, in your art practice, that kind of thing?
well, I mean, in general, I'm completely self-employed, so all my work is gone. I make about like half my living on art, and then the other half on like, sort of gigs and things like that. And so all of that's kind of out the window right now, which means I'm spending a lot of time at home. But I also, I think, have it, but because we don't really have enough tests, I can't tell. I can't confirm it. So I also spent like the past few weeks just quarantining myself. And yeah, so I've just been kind of homebound this entire time for the past like three, almost a month now. Yeah.
Wow. um,
Yeah.
okay. What's your work in the North Seattle College Art Gallery show, The Implications of a Simple Landscape? What's it about? How do how do you go about working? Where did it come from? All of those things.
So let's see. So for the past few years, have been doing work around invasive species and their links to sort of colonialism and our histories. So a lot of trying to trace our, I guess, like underlying cultural values about like in relationship to how we approach how we view them, and then also how we distribute them. I had a show last year where I started to map out the emerging global ecosystem that's coming from moving species around. I worked with an ecologist for, I've been working with him for a few years now. He gives me a lot of resources. And then I've also sort of picked up a few more academics throughout the years who have also kind of provided me with like resources. Like poet Natalie Martinez is one. She also is particularly interested in, she also has written about the ecosystem and is particularly interested in nature writing. So she gave me a lot of resources in relationship to sort of ecofeminist ideas. And then Julian Olden is the ecologist who kind of gives me a lot of resources. But basically, through them, I've sort of found a trove of information that, wow, I totally went off into another place. But through them, I found like a whole
Yeah.
trove of information that basically uh, kind of helps me trace these histories. So the emerging global ecosystem is kind of a result of like at this point our capitalist market, but then there's also different waves. So basically because we move and distribute goods around the world, oftentimes creatures come along with it, or plants or insects or diseases. Um, so basically like through that interchange, we've ended up with sort of this, it's like it's manifested on landscapes. So, you know, say a house sparrow is pretty ubiquitous around the world, especially in urban landscapes, or pigeons, something like that. Rats, mice, like those are pretty classic examples of didn't want. Then there's also a lot of things that we did want. And if you go through different periods of time, the introductions go from being unintentional to more intentional. So you have periods of time like at the height of England and France's colonial power. They were actually introducing species on purpose, usually European flora and fauna, and they were often doing it on what they considered to be impoverished landscapes, which were, you know, the lands they colonized. And then they were also in turn taking species and bringing it back, species that they particularly wanted or were interested in, bringing them back to their own countries and sort of trying to propagate and introduce them there. So, it kind of reflects our desires, like seeing which species pick, or which species end up being commonplace, I think ends up reflecting a lot of our desires, and specifically desires of the moment, depending on what's introduced. So I'll take species and scan them, like get pieces of them. So like shells, like Asian clam shells, which are um, globally distributed at this point, or rabbit fur, like European rabbit fur, that they're kind of considered a pest all over the world. And I'll scan them, and then I'll take those scans, print them out, and turn them into weavings. So basically, this it's kind of examining what's ended up in that mix, and hopefully you can kind of glean sort of something about ourselves like from that as well. So I've also included people in these things. I literally scanned my belly button, just to kind of have like some human presence in it. And part of it is really thinking about like in sort of reading about these histories. I a lot of what gets brought up, and a lot of like sort of, I guess, the crisis of conservation right now, and I think in general, like humanity is currently, like very currently, is sort of this realization that we are actually not as separate from nature as people think, or as we think, and we've kind of created this like binary or divide that actually doesn't really exist, and there's like real consequences to that. So, in that context, like I think part of what I'm kind of thinking about is the ways in which we're completely involved and completely a part of and completely unseparate from it's like from the landscape. And in ways that aren't just like we're doing things to the landscape, it's like the landscape responds, and the globe responds, and the world responds, because we're in it. Yeah, so humans are part of that. Yeah.
Yeah, and as you were talking, I was thinking about all of the maps that I'm watching grow, like how the spring break, the people who went to spring break in Florida sort of then brought the coronavirus sort of to different places because they were just all sort of together, and us tracking that. I mean, probably not something that you're specifically interested in, but it might be kind of an interesting time for you in that way, because it's the same kind of movement in some respects.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, honestly, like it's like funny because I was FaceTiming with some friends, and they're all kind of like, Jesus Christ, Markel, because like the stuff I'm reading right now, I think is a little bit too it's like I feel like I'm like in the end times, and people are joking about being in the end times, and then I'm like, that's great. Let's like here, actually, I can show you the books. It's like so like I like was like, let me just re-brush up on this book of essays. Um, which is like it's edited by Anna Singh and then a few other folks, but it's the essays are basically sort of talking about our interconnected world, trying to approach the issues of today from an interdisciplinary lens. So really getting like it's like anthropologists have written something, Ursula K. Le Guin wrote something in the book, a lot of biologists, you kind of have people across disciplines really talking about different global issues, whether that's like capital or radiation or like uh, man-made things, environmental issues, ecosystem issues. Like they're really talking about the whole range of these things, and kind of trying to figure out how we can sort of tackle uh, what are now global problems, from sort of a more a broader lens, or like a more unified lens. And so, I've been thinking a lot about the pandemic, and sort of even within it, like ideas of individuality, and then concerns for the collective. And I feel like within modernity, there's so much emphasis on the individual, and like uh, it's like it's been exported and like distributed throughout like these sort of underlying mentalities. It's like the ideas within modernity are at this point global, and at this point interconnected. And I think the pandemic kind of shows that. Like it's like it's just showing, like, it's very horribly showing just how interconnected we are. And to me, it creates even more of an urgency to really start thinking about things in a more collective sense, and that moves beyond, nationally. It moves into global. And so I think that, like a lot of what I'm thinking about right now is ways in which you can kind of both think regionally and think regionally specifically, while also being aware of uh, just the inescapable fact that we are so intertwined with each other. And then, to kind of add on to that, like what I'm kind of trying to think about it, like with that sort of thought in mind, like I feel like that thought needs to be extended into like beyond humans as interconnected, and really start thinking about just like the globe as a whole, Earth as
Yeah.
a whole, which, is like really hard, I think, for anyone to imagine, but, I think it's necessary. Um, yeah.
Wow. Well, I mean, just beautiful, intricate. Nothing is, one thing or another. It's all just interwoven and deep, and lots of layering involved in
Mhm.
it. What are you working on now?
Previously, I was making work about sort of what we're building. So, like, we've built on 75, or I think over 75% of the world at this point, and that's like rural to urbanscapes. And in that, we've drastically changed landscapes. And so at this point, specific species are thriving in those contexts, which I think are like what ends up being kind of the new global ecosystem. It's like the things that thrive with us. And uh, so I've like been focusing on that. And at this point, I'm kind of turning my attention to the things that we're losing. And I'm trying to kind of figure out how to, sort of in reading about both of these things, I'm trying to figure out how to kind of depict both like what we're creating and what we're losing, and try to kind of, I'm trying to figure out how to like create sort of a visual like scape for that. So, part of what I'm reading right now. So I just read this one, The Great Derangement by Amitav Ghosh, which I think actually anyone in the arts, like he's writing about the arts and why specifically why fiction writers have struggled to write about climate change. But I think that his insights are very much like he's got his finger on like the pulse of modernity, I think, in a way that's very interesting. And also like, uh yeah, it's very interesting and very insightful. And I think that you can kind of look at his ideas and apply it not just to climate change, but I think to like the broader ways in which we're kind of failing in a lot of concerns that are like large scale, like so large scale that it's like hard to conceive of. um so I'm reading that, and then I just started this one, The Sixth Extinction. um, and I'm early on in that one, so I don't really have an opinion or I don't really have a thought about it yet. And then, I showed you The Arts of Living on a Damaged Planet. I just finished. I had read that like selected essays from there, and I just uh, revisited them and then went back to it again. So those are like the three books currently. Oh, and then like this is my nighttime reading, the field notes on photography, which I read like a decade ago, and I'm now revisiting again. Same author as The Sixth Extinction, so Elizabeth Colbert. Yeah, I know it's like the most like abysmal, like just like I was like, pandemic, stuck inside for a month. I know. um, but like a lot of it really is to me like it's interesting because in reading about it, like for me, my way of dealing with anxieties in the world is I feel like I have to like engage with them to really like actually to oftentimes make peace with them. In like being able to think about it, I feel like there ends up being oddly sometimes an optimism that comes from it, or like if not optimism, then acceptance. And so for me, like reading about all this, it's like I do feel like we are overdue for we need to collectively change very quickly. um and uh and I don't really know how to do it, and so I think I'm just seeking answers. And I think that that was, even like with like the project originally started from thinking about ideas of foreignness, in part because like on a personal level, it's like I'm half Japanese and my family went through internment. And I think like there's a lot of ways in which like I see sort of it's like in the story of America and the United States, like this idea that somehow we have been this accepting country, that I just is not true. It's just not true. Just there's like these underlying cultural like norms and ideas that drive that end up sort of driving and perpetuating those issues to continue into the future. And I think that they're often not looked at. And I think that, so when I started looking at invasive species, a lot of it was kind of thinking about that. And it's, since really evolved from that into being like, well, this is actually like more global. I'm coming specifically from like being a US citizen and, having spent all of my life here. But I think that there's ways in which we can kind of like look at not just like ideas of foreignness, but like, and like otherness, but like the ways in which like sort of underlying ideas of modernity have like influenced the world we live in now and like sort of what's been created from that. I mean, I think for me, there's like I think a lot about it's like my world is a world with no lines. Like you can't really draw a line anywhere. It's like I'm mixed race, I'm queer, I'm like all of these things that like kind of are just like, well, where do I actually like fall into like anything really? And like, I think that like with all of that in mind, it's like for me, there's, it's like in studying like ideas of assimilation and immigration, it's like I think that for me, has always been like what makes me American or what makes me Japanese, which it's like I actually don't think like I am Japanese American and I've also never been to Japan. So like what does that what is my relationship to Japan actually? Or it's like I'm Irish American, like never been to Ireland either. Like what is my relationship actually to those cultures and to the literal land there? I don't actually know. And I think that that's oftentimes what I'm kind of puzzling over. Um, this project has kind of turned into what feels like it's going to be just a lifetime project, where like it started out being like invasive species, and then with like these sort of personal realms in it, which I think I am exploring tangentially. But it's also kind of evolved to explore all these other threads, which I feel like have to do with like, it's like from that, it's like ideas of like globalization kind of popped up and I can't help but look at that. I feel like all of these things are actually intertwined. It's like, um, but I think that for me, because it's like sort of a lifelong project, it's like I've been reading about this stuff for like and making work for about 2.5 years now on it. I started, like, I'd say the first time I really started thinking about it in in a more specific way was 2.5 years ago. And I feel like I know nothing 2.5 years later. I feel like I know so little and that my ideas are very newly formed and that it's going to take years to be able to really even be able to articulate how these things relate in a way that I think shows the complexity of like, yeah. And so like I think that current like this is where it feels like sort of like my practice hasn't really changed in this pandemic, in part because I feel like it's just like so much what's kind of started to happen more and more is research.
Mhm.
And uh it's like the work I make is in general in response to that research, and every thing I read or every person I talk to that kind of gives me more insight usually enriches the work itself in ways that means that it's like a constant ever evolving changing process. And so even having like events like that, like this, I think you know it it's so horrible, and it also is so oddly in line with like the things I was thinking about last year.
Mhm.
Uh, and it kind of makes it more like, I mean, it's a little horrifying to me. Um,
Mm.
I mean, more than a little. It's pretty horrifying, but
Yeah.
yeah.
There's so many
Um,
implications with the coronavirus, right? That
mhm,
like we don't even like the skimming of the surface is one thing, and then there's so many layered things. Again, like it's another,
mhm.
there's a huge issue with racism and a bunch of other ideas that just whatever.
Yeah.
It's not about me talking; it's about you talking.
It's bringing the things out, but I mean, our healthcare system, and how, it's like, why can't I get a test?
Hmm. Right.
Like we're not equipped for something like this. Um,
Yeah.
yeah, we're just not equipped.
What do you have coming up? Where can we see your work? All of those things.
So I have two shows coming up. One is, if as long as they don't get canceled,
Yeah.
one's at the Elizabeth C. Miller Library at the Center for Urban Horticulture at UW in July. So if UW's campus reopens in July, then it'll be open. Um, and then I have a group show for at the Seattle Japanese Garden for their 60th anniversary, and that's in August. And so I'm making works, kind of actually, so the Seattle Japanese Garden, I'm currently kind of thinking about, it's sort of, because it's celebrating their history, it's kind of trying to apply some of my researching practices, specifically for the garden, and making work in response to sort of the evolution of the garden. If I can get the resources to kind of research it. I've been kind of poking around. And then yeah, and then the Elizabeth Miller library, that one will just be whatever I've made at that point. We'll see. I'm not sure yet. Yeah.
It's fantastic. That's so wonderful. It's so great to talk with you.